Hello and welcome to the User Retention Bootcamp. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Mike and I'm on the product team here at Amplitude, and this is class number 2 of our 3-part series. For those of you that aren't familiar with Amplitude, we're a product analytics platform that helps teams better understand their user behavior in both mobile and web products. Product and growth teams use Amplitude today to quickly react to customer needs, ship fast, and ultimately build better products. A few things I'd like to mention before we get started about the viewing console that you're looking at. The first of which is that you can actually use the Q&A box to ask any questions as they come up over the course of our class. We'll also save some time at the end to use the chat window to answer those. Feel free to use Twitter as well to ask questions or even share what you're learning. Use hashtag Retention Bootcamp and make sure to mention us at Amplitude Mobile so we see your messages. And then lastly, in the resources menu, you'll see a few downloadable resources which I'll point you to during the class, and will be helpful for you to work through on your own afterwards. As I said, this is the second in our 3-part series. Last time, Alicia from our growth marketing team walked us through setting the foundation for building a sticky product. And today we're going to talk about how you can leverage that foundation to build comprehensive retention strategies across every stage of a user's life cycle through your product. If you haven't already, I encourage you to go back. If you haven't watched that series already, I encourage you to pause the video now before continuing and actually go ahead and watch that first episode. As I said, we'll be building on a lot of the principles that we talked about in the first part of the series. A couple administrative things too. Be sure to sign up for the third and final class in our bootcamp series if you haven't already. You can sign up and then we'll actually make all of these available on demand as well, and the third and final session will be hosted on August 9th. So let's go ahead and get started. A quick recap of what we covered in the previous session. We talked a little bit about understanding the product usage interval and determined what that might be for your own product or service. And we also got some baseline metrics on understanding our user behavior. In addition, we learned a bit about the retention lifecycle framework. Created cohorts for each stage of the life cycle, and learned how to identify behavioral personas. Now today, I'd like to dig into the different types of user retention and specific strategies for each of them. By the end of this class, we'll understand why behavioral personas matter and have a suite of tools to understand our users at each stage of the life cycle. We'll also identify the drivers of successful user onboarding and have an action plan for how to retain users at each stage. So lots to cover. Learning what active users are doing in your product can help you understand the value they get from it. An important thing to keep in mind is that people can be using your product in various ways and may not all be deriving the same value. And that's what brings us to the concept of behavioral personas. Buyer or customer personas are a common concept in marketing. A persona is a representation of a key customer segment that the marketer wants to target and can include customer demographics, habits, or goals. This information can help people develop the right messaging and marketing channels to reach that particular segment of potential buyers or end users. For this discussion, however, we're going to be talking about behavior personas, where each persona describes a distinct way of using your product. Much like in marketing, understanding these behavioral personas will inform your product design and development for different types of users. So why does this matter? Well, understanding how different groups of users behave and ultimately derive value from the product helps you, number one, shape the product to provide the best possible experience for these different types of users. And secondly, get a more nuanced understanding of your retention and product usage. It helps you identify parts of the product you can improve or even deprecate. Each persona may have drastically different retention rates or engage with parts of the product to varying degrees, all of which you miss out on if you only look at current users altogether. If you're still an early stage startup and can really only focus on one use case for now, your personas can help you decide which groups of users is the highest leverage group to focus on. If you have a larger team and a more established product, you might notice a new use case you hadn't thought of before. You start making some changes to improve that experience and even broaden the user base. At Amplitude, we talk a lot about the 1% rule. And according to this rule, only 1% of users actively create content in any internet community or social network. 9% of users may engage with the content, such as commenting, sharing, uploading, etc. The remaining 90% the vast majority of them only passively consuming content. Imagine if a platform like YouTube only focused on the 1% of creators and making the best possible experience for them, but neglected the viewing experience. That would have a tremendously negative impact on their ability to grow. While these actual ratios might not hold true for all social networks and certainly not across all types of products, the general takeaway still does. And you should never assume that all of your users are using the product that you've built in the same way or getting the same benefit from it. So make a conscious decision about the type of user you're optimizing for and their specific use case. To illustrate this point further, let's talk about one of the most beloved apps today, Instagram. So Instagram was actually originally called Bourbon and was a location-based app similar to Foursquare that included multiple features for checking in locations, or points, posting pictures, etc. But unfortunately, it wasn't seeing a whole lot of growth. And when the founders studied their user behavior and really dug into what features were being most used, there was actually a small group of users who were consistently using one aspect of the app, and that was posting and sharing photos. And so seeing that data, they decided to focus exclusively on photo sharing, making uploading photos fast, seamless, and really straightforward, an integral part of the product. In October 2010, they launched Instagram. We all know the rest of the story. Instagram gained tens of millions of users, sold to Facebook for $1 billion in 2012, and continues to grow. Bourbon could have just as easily been a failed startup, but instead its founders found one behavioral persona that was using their product and really built the back of their business on that persona. So now that we have a good understanding of what a behavioral persona is and why they're important for any stage of the business, let's dig in to understand how you can go about finding your behavioral personas in your own product. And to determine whether there are groups of people who are using your product in a specific way or for a certain use case, using both qualitative and quantitative approaches will get you a more complete answer. So let's talk about a few of those. For qualitative discovery, start with brainstorming some personas that you think or know exist based on your current knowledge of your users. Qualitative data from either user interviews or user testing can be really helpful for determining personas. And if you can, ask your customers, ask your users why they use the product and how it fits into their day. You can also study user activity timelines to look for behavioral patterns that jump out. And oftentimes, qualitative data provides more context for trends you observe in the user data. Now, while qualitative data is an excellent way to understand how and why your users interact with your product, it's also super important to supplement that knowledge with quantitative methods, which are more scalable and give you a more accurate picture. So here are a few ways you can discover behavioral personas through product analytics data. Number one, you can segment your user base by different user and event properties like city, country, or device family, for example. You can bucket users based on the frequency at which they perform certain critical events. You can also use a clustering algorithm, one like the one that powers Amplitude's Personas feature, to automatically group users based on similarities in their behavior and event activity. Let's talk about an on-demand delivery company as an example. Personas could depend on a number of different factors, like how often people place orders or the amount spent on the order. This company in particular used behavioral data to identify two kind of major personas that jumped out. The first of which are individuals, so people whose typical order size indicates that they're just ordering for themselves. And the second of which are group orders, people whose typical order size is above a certain threshold, indicating that they're likely regularly ordering for larger groups, things like family, groups of friends, or even a small company. They also use the second method of bucketing users based on frequency of performing certain events, in this case, placing an order. Now, the chart that you see on screen here measures a metric that is called stickiness, which says that out of a 30-day period, what is the percentage of users who place an order on at least N days out of 30? So you can see that a little over 75% of users place an order on 2 or more days out of 30, while only about 20% of users place an order on 7 or more days out of 30. Now, based on this data, the on-demand delivery company decided on these personas for order frequency. Occasional orders, people who place an order 1 to 3 days a month, and then frequent orders, so people who place orders on at least 4 days a month. And for these people, using the on-demand service is part of their routine rather than just an occasional convenience. So people who fall into different categories likely represent distinct demographic groups, that are using this service for different reasons. And it's important to understand why these personas exist or how these personas are defined, such that they can best meet the needs of the customers in each group. For most products, you can think about bucketing users into power, passive, and core personas. Now, this may not apply to every product, so think about whether it makes sense in your particular case, but you can have multiple personas in each category. For example, 2 types of core users who have distinct use cases. Power users, so people who use your product with a really high frequency or use power features of the product that the majority of other users don't take advantage of. And then core users, so people who are using your app at a regular frequency and in the quote-unquote expected way. And then lastly, passive users, those are people who might not be using your app in the core way that you designed it, but are still coming back at some sort of regular frequency to do something within the product. All right, so let's go ahead and start talking about the first of the 3 types of user retention that we'll cover today. The first of which is current user retention. Now, current user retention matters because it focuses on your most important users, those who are active now and are consistent users of the product. Understanding and improving the experience for your active users is critical for long-term sustainability of your business. Most articles like to talk about retention, focus on new user retention, but as discussed in Chapter 3 of the Retention Playbook and with the Retention Lifecycle Framework, the retention of your current and resurrected users can be equally as important. In fact, it's probably best to start with analyzing your current user retention so that you understand what successful long-term usage looks like. And then once you fully understand the value that users are getting from your product, you can leverage that information to create better experiences for retaining new users and re-engaging dormant ones. So once you understand what causes someone to become an engaged repeat user of your product, you can use that knowledge to get more people to become current users. So what is a current user? A current user is someone who's actively using your product with some level of consistency, where someone who is active in the previous time period, as well as active in the current period that you're measuring. So if we're looking at today, the current user is active today, as well as in the previous day. For example, if you determine that you have a weekly usage interval based on the usage interval calculation in Chapter 2 of the Retention Playbook, your current users are users who are active last week and active this week. So that's a weekly example. Now, with respect to measuring the goals of current user retention, there are kind of 2 primary things. The first of which is to get new users to form habits that promote them to becoming current users. And the second of which is getting current users to become core users, where core users then become power users. So you're trying to move new users to become current users and current users to become core and core to become power. Improving your current user retention is also critical to creating a sustainable business. If your retention curve, for example, doesn't flatten out at some point, it's impossible to sustain true growth. At some point, even if you keep adding users, your core retention will cause your overall growth to stagnate and, unfortunately, even decrease. In this example chart, you notice how the blue curve flattens out around day 7. Although there's an initial drop-off in the early days, a steady user base remains, and that user base is who your current users are. The green curve, however, keeps going down and never flattens off, meaning that the product is not attracting a steady base of people who keep using the product. And if your retention curve looks more like the green one and trends towards 0, that's an indication that you haven't reached product market fit. In that case, you should work on rethinking the core value of your product before optimizing for retention. So what are some of the strategies for understanding current user retention? Well, the first of which is to find behavioral personas of your current users, so understand the different types of users of your product. And secondly, discover the drivers of habit formation. What are the parts of your product, the interactions that people have that lead them to become engaged current users? And then lastly, identify the drivers that move your users from passive to core and core to power users of your product. To illustrate some of these points, I'd like to walk through an example from one of our customers, Calm. Calm is a mindfulness app for smartphones that provides meditation courses as well as scenes with calming backgrounds and sounds. And using the personas feature in Amplitude, Calm's product team identified 3 personas. They identified listeners, users who primarily listen to and swipe through different scenes. They identified meditators, so users who completed more meditations than average. And then alert savers, so users who turned on a feature that sends a daily reminder to meditate. Now, these users also completed several meditations per week on average. So the alert savers persona was particularly interesting because there was only a small percentage of users, about 1%, who were setting an alert. And the feature was buried deep in the settings screen of the app, so very few users were actually discovering it. But the users had super high retention compared to the other groups. And so using the Power, Core, and Passive framework, the company classified listeners as passive users, meditators as core users, and alert savers as power users because they were using a quote-unquote power feature. So when they compared the retention curves of each of the personas, they compared that of the listeners and meditators and found that both personas had similarly high day-end retention for the next 30 days after the current period, although listeners had slightly lower retention. Now, to see how these personas might differ in retention longer term, they looked at a weekly retention chart for the next 24 weeks, and this helped to uncover some larger differences. Alert savers have the highest long-term retention, followed by meditators, then followed by listeners. So based on the retention graphs, listeners are a fairly active passive persona, but still have lower retention than meditators long-term. Now, in addition, alert savers who set a daily reminder to meditate have the highest long-term retention at 24 weeks. And so to increase overall retention, Calm thought through ways of trying to convert listeners to becoming meditators and getting meditators to set daily reminders and become alert savers. At this point, I want to quickly point out one of the resources that we have available for download. Be sure to download the product usage interval worksheet, which is a great exercise to go through following this webinar or at any point in time to kind of put a lot of the strategies that we're talking about into practice. All right, new user retention. New user retention is probably the most commonly talked about and most closely analyzed. Many of the resources available today about new user retention are focused on how to retain this specific group of users, and for good reason. Recent benchmark data shows just how critical the early user experience is to long-term retention and growth and successful business. For the purpose of the discussion, a new user is someone who is using your product for the very first time. And we're going to be defining a new user as someone who is using your app for the first time in the current period that you are measuring. In a study of both iOS and Android apps on about 500 million mobile devices, we found that on average, an app only has 14% of users returning on day 7 after install. Now, this is measured on an end-day retention. We also benchmarked retention during a few time brackets, which show a more representative measure of activity than end-day, which only measures retention on single days. By bracket retention, the average app has 34% of users retained in days 1 through 7. So put another way, 66% of new users don't come back at all in the first week after install. So clearly the new user experience presents a huge opportunity for improving overall retention and growth. And when a user is experiencing your product for the first time, this is your opportunity to make a stellar first impression. If you don't successfully onboard a new user and show value as quickly as possible, there's a really high chance that the user will never come back. The overall goal of new user retention is to get users successfully onboarded into your product or quote-unquote onto the second date. Now, successful new user retention doesn't mean you need to show a new user every single feature you've built in their first session. And if you like to think about it like dating, the first date is about getting them to the second date, not getting them to marry you. So in the same way, focus the early experience on getting users to come back for the next session. Don't worry about long-term retention just yet. So what are some of the strategies for understanding new user retention? Well, again, find behavioral personas of your new users, very similar to understanding current user retention. Then identify the drivers of successful onboarding. And then lastly, identify the drivers of successful value discovery. Let's talk about some of those. After a user starts using your product, they progress through 3 phases: onboarding, value discovery, and habit formation. Users who don't make the transition from one phase to the next are considered churn. So the first phase, onboarding, is the first time a user of your product completes the onboarding experience and uses the product for the first time. In this phase, it's absolutely critical that you get users to experience your product's core value as quickly as possible. Value discovery, on the other hand, is after onboarding, where you have a limited window of time to continue showing the core value to a new user. During this time, make sure users are experiencing the core value as many times as possible so that they get a good understanding of how your product helps them or improves their current way of doing things. So when you're thinking about each of these phases, think about what are the behaviors that are going to contribute to pushing someone over the line into the next phase. Here are the basic steps to follow for finding these triggers. First of all, start with a base cohort of new users, just over any time period. And in step 1, create a cohort of retained users who were in the base cohort and retained in the value discovery period. Then create a churned cohort of users who were in the base cohort and were not retained in the value discovery period. Then compare your retained and churned cohorts to look for different behaviors that are present in the retained cohort but not in the churned cohort. And once you form some hypotheses of actions that might qualify as triggers, measure the difference in retention between users who do that action and users who don't do that action. In addition, try to identify critical bugs in parts of the onboarding flow, or consider events that are uncorrelated with retention. What are the behaviors of users who are in the churned cohort that are not exhibited as frequently in the retained cohort? So what are some takeaways and questions you can ask yourself? Well, for one, who are your new users and what are their behavioral personas or significant user properties? Is there a specific persona that you should focus on? Why do you think some of your behavioral personas retain better than others? Are there particular behaviors that seem to positively or negatively impact retention? How does the first-time onboarding experience affect later retention? Are there certain steps that can be improved? Is tutorial or structured onboarding beneficial for your product? Now, the third and final retention strategy that we're going to talk about is resurrected user retention. A resurrected user is someone who has returned to your product after being inactive or dormant for a period of time. Resurrected users are oftentimes overlooked when people talk about retention strategies, but they can actually offer a lot of potential for improving your overall retention and active user count. Put it this way. All of the users who churn from your product have the potential to be resurrected. If you're like most companies, that's a pretty big pool of users. In addition to that, you've already acquired these users. That means you have a better chance of re-engaging them than you do convincing a brand new prospect to try your product. Oftentimes, you can spend fewer resources, whether that's ad dollars or your team's time, resurrecting users than trying to acquire brand new ones. Resurrecting your inactive users can help you flatten the retention curve and increase your baseline of active users, and even in some cases, inflect the curve upwards, like in Evernote's Smile Graph. So a resurrected user is someone who has returned to your product after being inactive or dormant for a period of time. Specifically, we're defining a resurrected user as someone who is active in the current period, who is not active in the previous period, but was active at some point before that. So for example, if you determine that you have a monthly usage interval based on the usage interval calculation we covered in class 1, your resurrected users would be those who were active in the current month, not active in the previous month, and active at any point before that. Now, the overall goal of resurrected user retention analysis is to learn how you can resurrect or reactivate dormant users and get them to become current users of your product. So what are some strategies for resurrected user retention? Well, again, identifying behavioral personas of your resurrected users, identify the triggers of resurrection. What are the actions that lead to people coming back into your product? Or what are the events that lead up to users coming back into your product? And then compare resurrected user behavior to new and current user behavior. In his book, Hooked, author Nir Eyal talks about 2 types of triggers, external and internal. External triggers are things like push notifications, emails, or ads that we use to get users or potential users' attention. Many mobile apps use push notifications to encourage users to come back to their app. Internal triggers, on the other hand, happen in a person's mind. According to Neer, an internal trigger occurs when a product is tightly coupled with a thought, an emotion, or a pre-existing habit. For example, we may open Facebook when we're feeling bored or lonely. The impulse to open Facebook is cued by emotions. The best habit-forming products start out with external triggers to initially attract and educate the user, but over time, users no longer need the external triggers to keep using the product, relying instead on the internal ones. So for resurrected users, we want to identify an external trigger that might have brought them back into the product. And once we identify them, we can measure how effective they are at re-engaging users and think of ways to improve. If you have a website or a web app, look at session UTM parameters and refer data to look for common sources like an email campaign or an ad. If you do a cluster analysis to determine behavioral personas like we did in the previous section with the personas feature, you can look for events within each cluster that could have triggered resurrection. You could also analyze the paths of resurrected users using Amplitude's Pathfinder or similar path visualization tool, which can shed some light on why users are returning. Now, once you identify potential triggers, compare downstream metrics like critical funnel conversion rates and long-term retention for users who receive these triggers, and this will allow you to measure whether they're having the intended effect. In this example, we created a behavioral cohort of resurrected users who had received a special offer and found that 22% of all resurrected users had received a discount offer. Now, when we compared the critical funnel conversion rates for resurrected users who received the special offer versus those who did not, we found a dramatic difference. 94.5% of resurrected users who received the special offer completed an order, compared to only 26.5% for the rest of the resurrected users. So basically, almost every single user who came back to the app after receiving a discount completed an order. The team also looked at the conversion rate from receiving a discount to launching the app and found that 58% of users who receive a discount offer go on to launch the app within 7 days. Here's some takeaway questions following this section. First, what are the triggers of resurrection? Is there a specific persona that you should focus on? What are the unique behaviors of resurrected users? How does this compare to new and current users? And then lastly, what's the ROI of resurrected users? And how does it compare to acquiring new ones? So we've covered a ton in this section. We've covered understanding why behavioral personas matter and what they are. We've talked about diagnostics that we can apply at each stage of our user in their journey through our product. We've also talked about the drivers of successful onboarding and how to convert new users into core users and ultimately into power users. And then lastly, we've talked about an action plan about how to retain users at every stage of the life cycle. A quick announcement, again, be sure to sign up for the third and last class in our bootcamp. If you haven't already, you can sign up and we'll make these available on demand as well. The third and final series in this 3-part bootcamp is going to be hosted on August 9th. And that's a wrap. I hope you found this informative. I will be sticking around for a couple minutes here to answer any questions that you have. Thank you again for taking the time to join us today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.